Good morning, Kamla. Thank you very much. I am very encouraged by this global conference that Kamla has worked so very hard to put together in the midst of a global pandemic. I am also encouraged by Professor Garratt's opening remarks. I've had a peek at them, and I have to say they should encourage some healthy debate and conversation. Certainly looking forward to participating in that debate because I think it is critical at this time. And as we look at governance in the broadest sense, not just governance for publicly listed companies, but governance for non-profit entities, for any kind of organization, it is important that we focus on purpose, on values, and of course, all stakeholders, not just the shareholders or the employees or the customers, but also the suppliers, the competition, and the community. So I'm really looking forward to this, and I will now shut up and hand it over to Professor Garratt to lead us through some very interesting perspectives. Thank you, Professor Garratt.
Thank you, Nigel, and thank everybody for inviting me. Greetings from a chilly London. But I would like, first of all, to thank the CCGI Council for having the imagination to take the risk to run this activity. I think it's very typical of our times that so many people are now worrying about what to do, but you have managed to pull together some really interesting speakers and quite radical speakers in some senses from around the world who are willing to come online at various times during their day and nights to discuss with you. So well done for that. But particularly well done to Kamla, who has put such energy, particularly in the last 3 months, into getting this together. I'm astonished by her levels of activity, persuasiveness, and just raw energy to get things going. So I knew that every Sunday night around 8 o'clock my time, I would get a phone call to update me. And I was always amazed the number of people who said, yes, okay, I'll do that. So thank Kamla, and thank all the speakers and panelists who are also joining us over the next couple of days. I mean, the interesting thing about the COVID present pandemic is that on the one hand, it seems to have created an enormous depression in people and organizations and feelings of powerlessness and helplessness. But on the other hand, it's actually given everybody a time to pause and to think and to realize that what we were doing before may not have been the wisest thing of all to do, particularly across all of our types of organization. And the notion, therefore, of how it is that we should govern these organizations in future and what they should be focused on, what their purpose is, and then how they deliver that, has given a lot of people time to think. To my amazement, I've written 4 papers in the last 6 months instead of 1 paper a year, and had tremendous responses around the world from people saying, well, don't always agree with everything you're saying, but we all want to try and make big changes now. So the paper I've sent, and I think most of you have seen it, but if you haven't, it's online through Kamla, was called Towards the Bright Pyramid. And it starts with the notion of, can we escape the dark triangle? And this was referring really to lots of people phoning me, not just senior people in organizations, but fairly ordinary folk, and saying, you're meant to be a professor of governance, you're meant to know about organizing, you're meant to know about organizational change. Why is it that our health services and most of our public services and a lot of our private companies have responded fairly badly, at least in the early stages, to the COVID issue? We're beginning to realize our organizations don't work very well. And in some ways, they're right. On the other hand, human nature being what it is, it's to me astonishing that within 9 months, the turnaround has been so good. And whilst we're still looking at the economic aspects, I'm pleasantly surprised that, well, this coming month of December, we start a few vaccines in London, but after Christmas, we have 100,000 people geared up just to give vaccines. So we're expecting that by Easter, most of our population will have had that. And this is not just in the UK, it's happening in other countries as well. So things are beginning to move forward. But we can get ourselves stuck if we're not careful at these times of lockdown in this psychological notion of the dark triangle, which is where people come together and reflect on their powerlessness and the way in which those who they see as having power often use this strange combination, this strange psychological combination of paranoia, feeling that they're all against me, narcissism, focus on me, and psychosis to create a way of exercising and so often abusing power in organizations. I'm not mentioning any prime ministers or particularly presidents at the moment when I talk about the dark triangle, but or possibly ex-presidents now. But it is a worrying phenomenon that does occur, and there's quite a lot of good, solid academic research that shows that it is particularly prevalent in, I won't say the majority, but many chief executives in our major organizations. Now, you can understand how they get into that position, but what intrigues me at the moment is the public beginning to question the whole nature of our organizations and what is their purpose in future and how are we going to hold them to account because they believe something must be done at the moment. But as they begin to critically question what people are doing and what can be done in the future, it's becoming very obvious to me that there is an astonishing lack of knowledge about corporate governance, not just in directors and not just in regulators, but particularly in the public itself. So their ability to hold the legislators, the directors, the owners, and the regulators to account is actually very low. They don't really know what questions to ask. And so one of the things I hope might begin to come out of this conference, and remember, it's not just this conference. These are going to be held in one form or another every 2 months from now on. And it's the way we begin to develop these arguments about what can we expect the public to ask of us and what can we ask of each of the parties participating in corporate governance, which I think is going to determine the future. And I mentioned briefly in the paper, I was very taken a couple of months ago with a little quotation from an evolutionary biologist called E.O. Wilson, who simply said, we shall stumble into the 21st century, having created a sort of Star Wars style of civilization, which has Stone Age emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And that really struck quite a few bells with me that as we begin to say what we're going to do. It's not just about codes, it's not just about companies, and particularly not just about companies in the private sector, but how are we going to really think through what our future civilization is going to be? Because I argue very strongly that it is our organizations that develop culture and develop our civilizations. So that's my starting point. How do we begin to move away from the dark pyramid towards something more lively? And that means moving away, I think, from the rather ragbag of untested and long-held myths about corporate governance, particularly in the public's mind, and the very comforting ignorance there is of many of the players at the moment, including the directors and the legislators and the regulators? And how can we begin to pull together something that actually demands of our politicians that they take this a lot more seriously? And they do that by implementing the legislation which they normally have already passed, but done little about, so that we can begin to actually get a public feeling of what effective corporate governance is in all our organizations. Because at the moment, we often get into this silver bullet syndrome, whereby a single untested notion will be put forward and become often accepted very easily by the public and by the legislators to say, oh yes, that's a way of doing it. And whether it's, two-tier boards or whatever, that often becomes a main focus of it. And I think what's happening as people sit in lockdown and think it through, things like that just aren't a sufficient solution. We need much more integrated, a much broader and long-term societal solutions to agree ways ahead. And our common law has been, which is effective in the 54 Commonwealth countries, but actually in a lot of other countries around the world, our common law really affects about 70% of the total legislations in the world in terms of company law, has opened up to a whole series of pretty much self-perpetuating myths, or at least accepted open secrets, which we now need to challenge. And I've listed just a few of them in the paper. So, for example, it's a shock to many people, including many legislators and also many directors, that nobody owns a company. And that just a few days before lockdown in March in the UK, I was able to address about 100 people in the Houses of Parliament, a mixture of members of the House of Lords and members of the Commons. And I just mentioned that in passing and got a tremendous reaction, saying, what on earth are you talking about? You're mad. It's obvious that shareholders own a company. Well, I just quoted the particular piece of law at them, and they were astonished to find that their assumption, their easy assumption that by definition, shareholders own a company, and that therefore by definition, they should be putting pressure on shareholders to do all sorts of things to improve the governance of corporations, was fundamentally flawed. Now, I've written elsewhere about the Solomon's judgment of 1896, the fact it didn't actually resolve this problem, and it's been a running sore ever since. So the notion of limitation of liability wasn't solved. The notion of the controlling mind of a business was not solved. And therefore, we have let things just go on. And instead of actually really tackling the fundamental legal basis of what we're doing, we've in turn created a whole lot of codes, and we keep adding to the damn things. And I don't think that's very helpful if we don't understand the 2 or 3 key clauses in our Companies Act and in other countries' Companies Act that actually are the basis on which we're working. Remember, shareholders don't own a company, but they do have certain rights to dividends, to the residual assets of what's going on, the rights to vote, particularly in the AGMs and EGMs. Therefore, who becomes director, the dreaded and insoluble issue of remuneration of directors and executives. All those things, they do have some rights, but they're not particularly powerful. But they have become, though, very useful people to kick around if times are troubled. And that, sadly, again, talking in the House of Commons, or sorry, the House of Parliament, people were agreeing that they are very useful to kick, as are directors. But they're not really the people who have the long-term liabilities which directors and the company itself actually has. And so I'm going to argue a little more that we need to look about this power issue around the boardroom table and within society more broadly. the notion of the supremacy of power was meant to be part of the Companies Act, and the board was meant to have supreme power. We've seen the erosion of the power of shareholders, and really that in the end made the chief executive especially, and the executive team, or the C-suite as it's sometimes called nowadays, a much more powerful group of people who get on and actually make things happen. This was reinforced paradoxically in the 70s with Milton Friedman and the Chicago School of Economists arguing very well for free markets. But from that has emerged a rather hazy concept of shareholder value, which is not really very well tested. And the ironic or the paradoxical development of such power is that shareholder value actually has reinforced not the shareholders, but the position of the chief executive even further, to a point of them, many of them being rewarded what I would say was ridiculously well, and often on a simple criteria in the end of raising a share price, which often they alone can manipulate. So we're beginning to blame the board for an awful lot of things that increasingly they don't control. And what we're not doing is accepting the legal clarity which was beginning to develop under the Companies Act. And I would argue for the Commonwealth countries, under the 2006 Companies Act, we had two very, very clear clauses within it. Section 171 on the 7 duties of the director, and Section 172 on the purpose of a board in relation to the purpose of the company in its societal settings. And I'll come back to that in a minute, because I think if we can begin to build on things that have held firm, then we're in a better way. I worked with Adrian Cadbury over many years, over nearly 35 years, and not all the time, but we were also great friends and we corresponded a lot. And his act, the 1992 Act, was a breath of fresh air when it was introduced. And in fact, it even introduced the term corporate governance to a much wider public and to many directors. But just before he died, he wrote me a note when I was beginning to write the Stop the Rot book, saying, Bob, for God's sake, let us remember that corporate governance is not about applying codes. It's actually ensuring the proper direction of a business, and especially the proper entrepreneurial development of a business. And if we lose the entrepreneurial bit, then we're in trouble. And he was increasingly worried that over time, so many countries had simply copied his 1992 code and applied it to all sorts of organizations across the world. His worry was that it wasn't universally applicable. And in fact, it had only been written as an initial, draft document sponsored by the London International Stock Exchange and the Institute of Chartered Accountants for England and Wales. So its focus was very much on listed companies and finance. And as he drew towards the end of his life, he was extremely concerned that it had never been developed beyond those two elements. And yet that's what seemed to be needed. Listed companies often form less than 5% of the number of companies in most countries. And what was worrying Adrian particularly was that what was excluded was environmental and social impacts, and note the word impact, on the definition of effective practice of corporate governance. So I think the way corporate governance has developed, particularly in relation to supremacy of it, or the leadership of it being led by listed companies and the financial aspects, has distorted what we think of as good practice. And that, it is not holy writ. And it is almost treated as though it was now. What's particularly worrying, and I see this happening more and more in many countries, I'm extremely fortunate in the number of countries that I visit, is that it's become almost a regulator and a bureaucrat's dream, because they can insist that what was written is followed. And if the public gets upset about it, they simply add more codes rather than returning to the original law and looking at what does it say, and then asking a good question for the public: why is it not implemented? And that's a big issue that I think we need to discuss. And it's got to a point now where more and more secondary legislation is being written or alluded to, which is actually in contradiction to the basic law, so section 171, 172. So we end up with things like non-executive directors, which don't exist in that law. We end up with senior independent directors. We end up with all sorts of things on the number of years or months people can serve in certain roles, etc. None of which really, I argue, are of great importance. They don't follow the basic law. But they are becoming, again, accepted generally, often by a rather ignorant public. And they have no reason to not accept them, because that's what the people who are meant to be in charge are saying. So we can get really odd interpretations of what effective corporate governance is. And so one of my arguments, which I've written elsewhere, is that we may be able to reduce our codes, our corporate governance codes, to 2 pages. And one of those is section 171, or the 7 duties of a director, and the other is section 172 on the purpose of a board, and the purpose of the board in relation to its wider societal setting. And that's where I turn to then, the very fashionable notion of ESG, and the move towards possibly not a dark triangle, but a bright triangle. And it's very interesting that we seem to be now viewing quite rapid convergence of environmental issues and societal issues, and I would argue economic issues, onto governance itself. And that really is a massive rethinking of what governance should be about. We've had quite a lot of not just protest groups and such like demanding elements of that, not always integrated, but elements of that. But we've also seen since the 2008 financial breakdown, the Western financial breakdown, that a number of people since, very powerful people since, have actually been giving mea culpas. So we saw Alan Greenspan, for example, the ex-chairman of the US Federal Bank, when he published his book, The Map and the Territory, admitting that they didn't know how to control what was happening through 2009, when the markets were just melting down. He actually says, our models did not work, despite me having 250 PhDs working flat out for me. The models simply would not respond to what was happening. And he says the driving factors there, which we had not considered important, were the nature and speed of market dynamics. So things are happening so fast, often driven by technology. And what he realized only much too late was the great importance of people, which is quite an astonishing statement. But he actually says the great importance of people and their unpredictable emotions. And that was fascinating, because he was a classic rational economic person, completely at sea when he was faced with what people really did and their fears and their greed during this time. So it intrigued me that Alan Greenspan in retirement, one of the first things he did was take a course in anthropology. And he said he got a lot out of that because he began to realize there was a whole other aspect of governance generally, which wasn't about rationality and economics. It was about very different things. And then last year, 181 CEOs from the US Business Roundtable committed, and I quote here, to lead their companies for the benefit of all their stakeholders, employees, customers, suppliers, communities, and their shareholders. I would argue that this was really the more public acknowledgement, and the acknowledgement by the, if you like, the establishment that the age of, quote, ESG has now arrived. ESG being environmental, social, and governance, and then a very important word, impacts, the environmental impact, social impact, governance impact, rising to the fore. They had been growing before that in the public consciousness. And as I say, there have been elements of various focus groups and protest groups who have been arguing for this, but it looks as though it's beginning to move on to the middle ground now. ESG seems to have replaced what was then just about acceptable CSR, the corporate social responsibility movement, but that was always quite a weak notion. And it wasn't defined, and there weren't any really metrics for it. I would argue that CSR was really a bit of a wimp. But ESG looks as though it's got some legs. It's a much harder concept. And it's beginning to incorporate now, listening to the demands of the environmentalists, for example, impacts on global warming, zero carbon, deforestation, etc., etc. Those impacts with social impacts on communities within which the corporation operates in terms of employment, supply chains, customer satisfaction, etc. And in fact, in the COVID environment, it's been very interesting to see the way in which communities, having been thought to be not very important and fairly fragmented, have come together at various levels in many countries. And in doing that, have been looking to protect employment, but also to have much more efficient supply chains, much greater levels of customer satisfaction there. And there are so many examples now of the societal impact that's occurring that we begin to see some interesting examples of the way in which metrics are being developed. But what interests me, we begin to see more focus on E and S, but not so much on G. And what is governance impact? And we're back, I think, to not understanding really the purpose of the company, the duties of the directors, how we induct and develop both individual directors and boards, how we assess the performance of those directors and the executives, and how we can begin to develop scorecards or ratios or whatever you want to call them that actually begin to pull together E, S, and G in terms of a system of governance, which is very different from what has been going on before. I think that's part of the challenge for this conference. And a lot of the people who are talking during the conference will be referring to their particular aspects or their integrated aspects of that. However, as many of you know, I didn't come up a normal business route. Well, I've spent a lot of time in business and running my own businesses. My background is architectural education. And one thing about architecture is you have to think in 3 dimensions, not 2 dimensions. And I argue very strongly that a lot of business still will only think in 2 dimensions. So if we're getting a triangular base for future corporate governance, which is going to be based on the environment, environmental impact, social impact, we need to have the third side of that triangle, economic impact. I think ESG has rather dropped the notion of entrepreneurship and the economic side. We need to have that to give a solid triangular base. But then we need to move into the third dimension, which is where I believe the whole issue of governance comes in. And at the top of that, we have public oversight. So I'm not just drawing a triangle, I'm actually drawing a pyramid. Public oversight at the top, governance being the dynamic integrating mechanism of the triangular base of economics, environment, and social development. And I think that's a major mindset change for the 21st century. And as we have time to do a bit of thinking right now, although please God, by Easter, we'll be beginning to move out of the worst of the current lockdown globally, then we're beginning to see ways in which we might develop this, and which is where I think the idea of 2 monthly meetings of this group and others is really going to take us forward a lot. I think if we can deliver economic wealth and balance it with the social side and with moral sentiment, social justice, and environmental balance, and effective governance, then we really are moving forward. And that, I think, is the challenge of this conference, and that's the challenge I pose to you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Garratt. That was quite stimulating, quite a bit to ponder and to think about. I personally believe that you cannot have long-term economic success unless you adopt a holistic approach to governance, that one starts with all stakeholders and on value creation, as opposed to focusing on simply the shareholder and the short-term share price or short-term profitability. But enough of me. I want to introduce the first member of our panel, Charlotte Valeur. She's currently the founder and chair of Board Apprentice UK and a former chairman of the Institute of Directors of London. So Charlotte, share your thoughts on this very interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me here. I'm very excited about taking part in this, and thank you to Professor Bob Garratt for the great presentation on this subject. Things has indeed changed quite a lot, and yes, ESG is very much on the forefront of certainly all the boards I serve on and that I advise as well. It's something we work with on a very conscious basis, being very aware that if we don't, we're going to fall behind in a way that will undermine our businesses and the countries our businesses operate in potentially as well. So that much broader look at governance, exactly as we just heard, in a more holistic way, is absolutely key for moving forward. It is, however, still strangely something that many people find difficult. And it's great we have people like Bob to go out and kick around a bit. And I tend to try to do that as well, to sort of provoke thinking outside of the standard box that people sort of historically have been in when they were dealing with governance. And as soon as you hear someone talk about box ticking, obviously, you know that they haven't got it, because governance is so much more than that. And then you have to start from a much lower level and then build up their knowledge to a place where they understand that it's about embracing it in a much wider way. For me, governance is the umbrella over pretty much everything. It's also the umbrella over the E and the S, because without proper governance in place, you won't actually really achieve anything with the E and the S. That all gets solidified. Whatever you want to do in those areas gets solidified through the governance that you perform, in my view.
Thank you very much. And let me ask Wahid Shukri, who is currently a member of the board of directors of GCC in the Gulf region and a senior external BBI associate. Wahid, what are your thoughts?
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you, Professor Garratt. That was very enlightening. I'm looking at it in two folds in terms of what's happening on the ground. And I think what's impacted governance, I think also is we're moving towards really, we're having virtual meetings now basically 99% of the time. And the way you create boards and the way you govern boards has changed. The diversity of the boards now is also, I think it's easier to have a very diverse board because you can get anybody in the world from any jurisdiction. We're meeting here and you're in a time zone, I'm in a time zone. So I think all of that is definitely impacting the way companies will be governed in the future. How it'll look and how do you govern, it's interesting. In terms of ESG, yeah, definitely you hear it. Everybody wants to do it, but is it really ingrained within the organization? Is it truly measured independently? To a certain extent, I think, I've seen it, some organization, it looks good. Sometimes you get even external consultants to do it for you and report it. But I think to really get it ingrained, I think you have to have investors, shareholders, financial institutions really asking for it, and they're driving it, and they want it to be independently verified. And then once that happens, I think you'll start seeing the mindset change that we're looking for. So that's my view on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll come back to you with some questions afterwards, but I want to hand it over to Joanne Salazar, a fellow director on the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute, who also serves with me on the National Flour Mills Board. Joanne, what's your take? What's your perspective?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Nigel. And it's a great to be part of this panel. Just a few things. For me, we're still toying around with a framework that really doesn't give stakeholders any rights. And what I would like to see is that very much we start off from actually giving stakeholders enforceable rights. So it's now not just a nice to do, it's not just a desirable, it's not just something that looks good when you're on your annual report, but it's something that has real teeth, and that if we give stakeholders enforceable rights, I think we will begin to see the needle moving with regard to ESG. I was very struck by what Professor Garratt said about directors being part of that group of people who are not quite familiar with, they're familiar with the theory, but not the kind of the practical of their duties and responsibilities. And that's really scary when you think about it, when you think about what directors are liable for. But I'd like to say at this point with respect to ESG, that yes, what I think we need to do, or what I'd like to see us do in the future governance framework models, is really put the stakeholders truly at center stage. And I think when they begin to exercise their rights and muscle, we'll begin to see the needle move in the area of ESG.
So I'd like to throw out, I'm reading Conscious Capitalism right now by John Mackey and Raj Sisodia. And they are very clear that conscious leaders, and I'm quoting from the book, conscious leaders are motivated primarily by service to the firm's higher purpose and creating value for all stakeholders. So ESG is good. The point that I believe is that total focus on all stakeholders is good for business, because in the long term, it makes you more profitable. And I have absolutely no problem with profitability, as Mackey and Sisodia say, like all businesses, conscious businesses are subject to the discipline of the market, and they need to deliver strong financial results. So the point is, and I'm opening up to all of you and anybody else, quite frankly, are we doing this because we are interested in the environment and the social aspects, or are we doing it because it's good business? It makes sense for the success of the organizations that we serve.
So I think that's a very interesting question I had to come out with, because I think we have different groups of people doing it for different reasons, right? So so there are people that deeply believes in the whole holistic piece, that we need to do this because in every way it's the right thing to do, both financially, economically, and for social reasons. I think I would really like if we could see all leaders understand of organizations understand that their organization wouldn't exist if the people didn't exist, right? Mm-hmm. If we didn't have countries and laws and infrastructure, mm-hmm. nobody can get wealthy from anything without people. Mm-hmm. And therefore people are ultimately, all the people in the world and the world at large are ultimately the stakeholders that everybody needs to be concerned with, because once we've killed everyone, nobody gets rich, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the way we're going. So if we don't start focusing on this and do it rapidly, we are, in some strange way, I would hope that we cognitively have developed to a high level where we can understand that we cannot just follow our ego and our greed and think that continues to be okay. What we saw as capitalism in the last century should mm-hmm. move into what I would call valuism, where it's about the overall value to everything, not just financially, but also environmentally and socially. And when you can meet all of those three different value terms, then you can go and do a business. But if you haven't got balance in those ones, you shouldn't even be allowed to run business at some stage. This is a bit premature probably, but that's where we should be going, right?
Mm-hmm. And I think, Nigel, that COVID has taught us some very, very stark lessons, in the sense that what wasn't deemed, I sometimes give the example of, in corporate life, if someone had come to us in our company and said, oh, we'd like to work from home, we would have launched a review process by HR, which would have been brought back to the executive. And 10 months later, we might have actually moved the needle in people working from home, but it would have come from a point of skepticism. Yeah. COVID has arrived, and in 48 hours, everybody's working from home, and the world did not tip off its access. And to me, there's a valuable lesson in there. And what people value and have value for, there are some people who are saying that even if I can go back to work full time, I really don't want to go back to the sitting 2 hours in traffic to get to work, the grind at work, and then sitting 2 hours in traffic to get back home. And my relationship with my kids being yelling at them in the morning because I'm late, or yelling at them in the evening because I'm tired. So very much, I think this, to me, the leap that we can take is around, I agree with Charlotte, it's around the people, who are we doing it for? What is the, almost a meaning of life question? And then saying from that, working out from that perspective. I think COVID invites us to be really radical, not incremental, but really radical in our thinking.
Yeah. And it shows us that we can.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. So thank you for that. Now I want to get Wahid, what's your perspective on the economic aspect and that ESG is good for the second E as well?
Well, I think definitely. I mean, I've seen organizations already on the ground on some of the companies I'm currently serving. For example, a company would have an entire building a year ago, and now they're saying, I don't need all of this space. Mm. I think certain functions, certain employees don't need to be here. They can work out from home. Some of the areas and some of the functions, I don't need full-time employees. They can come in and work on a contractual basis. They come in, do the job, and leave. So there's definitely been an impact socially on people, how they function, how they work. Is it for the better? Well, it's early days. I believe it is, but it's an evolution. There's something that cannot happen in the span of just a COVID crisis in 12 months. I think you need more time to deal with it. But in the long run, I think it's going to be more efficient. It's going to be more flexible. But it'll take time. It's we're going to have some bumps on the way. It's not going to be easy. How do you regulate people working from home? What kind of contracts you have with them? What's oversight? Mm-hmm. Does organizations' internal control gets jeopardized or get reduced because of the way we're functioning now? So you get into the issue of privacy and data, and so I think there's a lot of dynamics to this, and it's early days, and the impact I don't think we fully know yet.
Thank you. Let me go back to Joanne and something she said. Enforceable stakeholder rights. What does that mean? What does that look like?
Well, interestingly enough, sport can teach us some lessons with regard to this, because when you look at sports governance, the stakeholder, the spectator, is actually an integral part of the output of the sport. This is what football is now learning in everywhere, that with absence of spectators has a momentous impact on the experience of the sport, what you experience. And sport governance really comes from the fact of, it was really run by volunteers on an amateur basis. And now, unfortunately, they're trying to wear the clothes of corporate governance. But the stakeholder there has a much more influential role, because they're not only a receiver of the output of the sport organization, they're actually an integral part of how the sport organization delivers its product. So the issue that there's a translation there to the corporate sector to say that instead of having stakeholders as a desirable, a nice to have, move them from being on the edge of your thinking to be central, and that if they became an integral part in how you delivered or what you needed to do to deliver your core purpose, then you would then begin to see a moving of the needle, with a moving of the ESG needle, because it can't help but move, because you're now taking on board a different flavor and then building in a different ingredient is to what's important about how you do whatever you do, because they're an integral part of it. So having that enforceable right, instead, at the moment, the corporate governance framework we have has worked well, but it is very centered on enforceable rights of the stakeholder. So unless the interest of the stakeholder, the shareholder and the stakeholder coterminous, the stakeholder gets left out. So that's why I'm saying, I think that for the future, when we're talking about the future of governance, our frameworks as number one criteria, the tick in that box has to be the first box it has to tick. For me, is that stakeholders have enforceable rights.
So, but in that particular case, I am very wary of enforceable rights.
Yeah.
Enforceable, I'm very wary of. And in that particular case where the spectator is in fact the customer, for me, in other than the sport analogy, in the business analogy, where the customer is a critical stakeholder, the market decides. If you don't take care of that critical stakeholder, if you don't take care of your people, if you don't take care of the communities that you serve, your business's shelf life is going to be very limited. So for me, the market is the enforcer, as opposed to some authority from the top. But I think part of the education has to be educating directors, educating management, that a holistic view of purpose and values and how you deliver those on your purpose are critical to long-term success. And we have so many businesses kind of demonstrating that.
No, I agree with you, Nigel, but what I'm just saying is that in sport, the spectator is your source of income as well, because a football club without supporters makes no money.
No, exactly.
So they're not only part of how you deliver the product, because they're part of creating the atmosphere in the stadium when the game is taking place. They're integral to that, but they're also your source of income.
No, clearly.
I find it very interesting. I was deliberately holding back because later on today and early tomorrow, we will have two, what I hope are going to be very interesting sessions. One by Mike Manelli, who is the sheriff of the City of London. And then one by Peter Aylwin. And they both have rather novel views on the creation of wealth. And I think part of what we're talking about, we mentioned capitalism, but I'm very interested in the way we're beginning to redefine wealth. So it's not just the capital wealth, but or the economic wealth. It's also about social wealth. It's also about environmental wealth. In fact, actually, if we go back in history, we seem to be reintegrating the notion of commonwealth. And the role of the company or the organization, if it's not a for-profit organization, in the creation, the sustaining of the commonwealth. And I don't want to steal the thunder of either of those two.
Right.
I want to wait and encourage everybody to try and listen in, because on the one hand, I think Mike's notions of the way in which wealth will be used in future, and particularly possibly the notions we're going to measure the development of economic wealth, the development of environmental wealth, and the development of social impact is very important. And he will mention, as long as Peter will as well, Peter Aylward will as well, the possible development of new types of funding, not exclusively, but focus in part at least on the creation of bonds. And the notion of now environmental bonds, of social impact bonds, we already know about economic bonds, but the one that intrigues me is, can we develop the notion of governance bonds as part of new ways of funding the commonwealth? But I won't say any more because I don't want to steal their thunder, as I say. But I'm just very interested in that and the way in which that seems to add to the flavor of what's coming through from our panelists.
Jackie, you had a question or a comment?
Yes. Well, I agree with Professor Garratt, and a lot I would like to say is what I intend to say this afternoon when we get to that point. So I'm going to try not to say it now.
All right, okay.
But I did want to say in the first instance, I felt we were giving, say, traditional corporate governance a little bit of a bad rap. I think it was a road we had to walk at the time. When we introduced the code in 2013, say in Trinidad and Tobago, it really, I think, started off as a box ticking exercise. But I think we learned a tremendous amount from that exercise. It did sensitize certainly all the publicly listed companies to the fact that you needed corporate governance. I think we are learning as we go along that it is much bigger than what we said traditional corporate governance was, and it has to develop into something more than that. There was a quote I had found somewhere that a business cannot succeed in societies that fail. So you do need the structure of the formal code, and we did learn important lessons from that. We learned about diversity of boards, and you can't sit on a board for the rest of your life and things like that, which made us think. So even now, if we have the choice that, yes, I can sit on the board for the rest of my life, it has to be a conscious decision. And we didn't consider those things before. But now we have to move from that point on to a different phase and answer the question, what is the role of this organization in society, and how do we pull it all together to create value, and what is the true value? And that will lead us on to what we're going to discuss this evening. Thank you.
Nigel, you're muted, but
sorry, Camille?
Yes,
Camille had her hands up. Go ahead, Camille.
Right. So first of all, thanks to Prof. Garratt and the panelists. Excellent presentation, Professor. So you spoke about having an interest, the shareholders having an interest in the company. So it's a similar concept with land. We don't own land. You have an interest in land, a fee simple interest or a leasehold interest. However, looking at it from my perspective, having worked in multinational organizations, I have seen the power of the shareholder, because especially say in the UK, where you have your pension funds, etc., they come together and they will remove a CEO through the board. So I do think that that shareholders have a great deal of power, and I have seen them exercise that power, because they will change that chairman, they will change that board, and a new board coming in very often changes the CEO, because very often they want their own person. So I just wondered about that aspect of things.
So the question I would, go ahead, Professor.
Well, yes, I agree. In fact, actually, next week I will be talking to, quite independently, to two of the major London investment groups on how they are thinking of really dramatically changing their approach to ESG. Now, right at the moment, I don't know what they're going to say, but if they've come to me and they've read some of the stuff I've written recently, then I'm pretty sure I know the area in which they want to debate anyway. And they, as agents of shareholders of pension funds, etc., and great wealth funds, are in, the one thing they have both said independently to me is that we are increasingly uncomfortable with our role as the agent of these folk at the moment, because we're being pressured in ways to develop ESG, where we do have the powers you just mentioned, but we're rather loath to use them right now because we don't know exactly how we can, on the one hand, generate the continuing wealth, and particularly, for example, the pension funds, that the expectation is there, but against the same people having increasingly vocal views on environment and social impact. And so it's muddled at the moment. And there was a very good piece in, I think it was the Times, so it must have been the end of last week, Thursday or Friday, a whole special supplement on sustainable investment, which I read with great interest, because when you looked at it, everybody was saying, we know we've got to change, we don't know where to, but we know we have to.
And I think that's the opportunity that we are presented, where how do we help them? How do we show them to make the transition with the clear understanding that this is in their best interest and their company's best interest in the long term, not necessarily the short term. Kamla? Somebody was saying sorry.
No, me. It was me, Nigel.
Yeah, go ahead.
Camille, let me throw a couple of statistics at you, because you say that the shareholder is powerful, but the question will be to whose benefit? Because in 1992, when the Cadbury Code was produced, 70% of UK shares, the shares of listed companies, were actually in the hands of UK pension funds, UK insurance companies, and UK individuals. By 2016, that percentage had dropped to 50%, which meant the other 50% belonged to shareholders who were overseas. So when you're now saying that so one of the challenges is when you say, okay, we're now going to rely on the shareholders, you have to be very clear as to who those shareholders are and where they reside, because they may take actions that are in their best interest, but not in the best interest of the stakeholders in the vicinity of the company that they're actually operating on. So there are some challenges with that.
Right, and if I may, Mr. Chairman, may I? Right, so I was just dealing with the concept of where the power still lies, not how that power will be exercised. And I am saying that the shareholders continue to be powerful. And because of the investor groups and the investment managers for pension funds, etc., they wield significant power where, as I said, I've seen them remove CEOs, remove chairmen.
So Camille, is it that they don't know how much power they have, or they're not organized to use that power?
They are prepared. I think Prof. Garratt just referred to it. They think that their responsibility is to use it to get the best return for their investors. So now they are looking at it, and in this new dynamic which we're all faced with, they're now looking at their responsibilities for social environment. They're adding it, but they're trying to figure out how best to do that. And I think, isn't there a group of bankers, the bankers now, through the UN, UNEP, they're now promoting proper environmental management, and banks have signed up. Several banks, I think it was. I have to find the statistics, who have signed up to now determining, using some of these factors to determine who they will lend money to. But again, everybody's struggling to see, how do we take this forward?
Definitely. Kamala?
Yeah, thank you, Nigel. Very thought-provoking, but one of the things I thought that Professor Garratt raised that really struck me, because so many of us do adhere to the codes of governance as though this is the real framework that guides the boards. But we have so many directors here who would have had to set what their parameters are for behavior. And I'm wondering, you know, based on what Professor Garratt said about the Cadbury report not having meant to be the full standard, but rather it was supposed to be a foundation piece, which we then build on the basis of our experiences. So for instance, the Trinidad and Tobago Corporate Governance Code at this moment needs to be reviewed. And I agree with Professor Garratt, we've seen it. All the codes around the majority of countries really did simply replicate a lot of the rules that were outlined and recommendations from the Cadbury report way back in 1992. So how much has the world changed, and what have we learned? And therefore, what are those elements that now needs to be incorporated in that governance framework, which is going to guide our behavior and our decisions in the boardroom? That, I think, is very intriguing.
Yep, good point.
And who are we going to make it applicable to?
Well, I think we still need to consider the fact that the decision-making takes place in the boardroom. And therefore, we continue to have to place the responsibility in the hands of directors. And we have to ensure that the board recognizes its role to be accountable. So, you know, that I think we don't want to remove, because that is a very important mechanism to ensure oversight of the management of that board. And what I think we'd really like to explore, so I would ask Professor Garratt if he can really develop it and share with us, if possible, even within the next 2 days. And that is the pyramid that he is proposing, as what really maybe that construct that helps us to then develop what are the guidelines that we wish to adhere to, by which we must now be judged by. So when we add all the elements together that Joanne is speaking to in terms of having stakeholders, being able to have a very real value in holding us accountable as board members. You know, what is that new system going to look like that we could share with everyone and say, this would be what governance looks like as we move forward?
Let me turn to Wahid and ask, Wahid, do you have a corporate governance code in the Gulf? And is it a box ticking exercise? And what's going on in your part of the world?
I think within the Gulf, the GCC countries, it varies from country to country. I think some countries are more, I think in Saudi Arabia, it's very close to the UK. I think it's one of probably the more stringent. And the way I've seen corporate governance happen, I mean, I've served various entities, from family businesses to closed joint stock to companies that are about to list or list. And the way I've seen it, it's, you know, a lot of the companies that want to list, they start out and you see that there's a big, what I say, a big gap or in terms of maturity between governance and between what we mean profitability of the entity. So the company, they move on from being a sole proprietorship, moving on to being a family business, becoming a closed joint stock, and then becoming listed. And when the time and what happens, you see that the maturity in these entities are, family businesses are sometimes in the billions, but when you look at their governance structure in place, it's very weak. And as you know, the world and even this region is dominated by family businesses. And then it becomes more of a, well, I want to list the company. So if you want to list, it's a ticking exercise, and they tick the box to get the file ready for the capital markets and for it to pass. So I think, yeah, it is a ticking exercise. I don't think company maturity and governance maturity moves in the same rate. I think there is definitely a gap. And unfortunately, it only happens when the regulator comes out and says, okay, you want to be listed, these are the requirements. So they shove it through, try to get it done as quickly as possible. It becomes a ticking exercise, and then they list. And subsequent to listing, then, you know, the company goes through an evolution, and then they try to do it correct. And hopefully you get, you know, some a more mature board, more independent board members that really will put the company in terms of asking for more governance, more maturity, more. It doesn't become a ticking exercise, then it becomes really ingrained within the fabric of the organization.
And the question for that I would have is becoming more mature in terms of the governance, does it help you to be more successful, more profitable, and longer lasting?
Yes, because once you get into the overall control environment of the organization, you have proper controls in place, you have proper oversight in place, and that's all part of the governance. And I think it does lead to, having a more successful organization, because if you don't have all the pieces in place and all the proper control environment, you become inefficient. You could become, and you see that, I do see that in organizations that I serve, some of them, is that you do, when you improve the governance and you improve the control environment of the organization, it really becomes more effective, more efficient for the organization.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Charlotte, any observation?
Yeah, I was just, thank you very much, Nigel. So I serve on some very large private companies, family-owned businesses as well, and have done for years. And what I find, some of these businesses are very, very good in terms of having really strong values and strong purpose for what they do. They are so big that the owners or the family are not in the real detail, but they are doing the oversight and everything. And actually, they seem to be running really seriously good businesses without having to follow a corporate governance code. They do all the right things because they are smart enough to understand that it makes their business a better business. Fundamentally, corporate governance guidance has come in because too many people didn't know what good looked like. They didn't understand how you should run a business in the right way for everybody to benefit the most. But some people did know. Obviously, Cadbury knew, Bob Garratt knew, without having a code. So there will be people who almost intuitively know what it means to run good business. And the ones I have come across are the ones that are run by strong values, strong positive ethical values, and with a strong purpose of what is the right thing to do. And the kind of conversations I come across in those kind of organizations is always about right and wrong. I mean, and it's not about egos or self-agendas. It's just about what is the right thing to do, what's the wrong thing to do. And yes, they have built massive businesses that is helping the family to be very wealthy. But I can truly say that some of the ones I've been working with do that on very, very strong governance without having a code they have to follow.
Yeah. The code is a guide, really, and
that's
I
right.
agree
For people
with
who doesn't know.
Exactly. Being clear about purpose and the values that will inform the kinds of behaviors you're looking for is critical. And once you have that, the code is
everything else comes behind it.
Exactly.
It becomes the music in the background.
Exactly. And Kay has an interesting perspective. She says, stakeholders will have conflicting interests. And of course, managing those interests are important. And she says perhaps they really putting values and principles as the core it makes sense. And I agree with that, because as I said, the economics is important, the environment is important, the social is important. But without that, the economic base and understanding the long-term impact of your decisions on the economics, which includes the environmental and the social, you're not going to go anywhere. So
I had a comment to that. If you don't,
yes, Wahid.
I mean, if we look at family businesses globally, I think the percentage of families that reach the third generation, I believe it's like 3% or 5%.
Yeah, low.
On a global basis. So that means, at the end of the day, are these families properly governed? Do they have proper succession plan? Do they have, above the line, the ownership is separate from running the business? Is that all there? And to me, I don't think it's there. And I see it in this region. We don't have it there. So,
and we see it in this region as well.
So it is it's like a global pandemic.
of poor governance.
Yeah.
But it's very hard for the family-owned businesses, right? I mean, next gen is always an issue, because not all next gen want to go in the footsteps of their parents, right? They want to go their own way. So what I have been involved with on several occasions is also helping a family business to change ownership, not to the next gen, but to outside of that, because the next gen isn't that interested.
No,
they want to have their own path.
Yeah.
And if I may add, Nigel, one of the concerns that I would have as someone looking outside of the organization is when it is you have boards where those values don't exist. Those values that Charlotte spoke about, and that is why the framework for governance is important. That's why the board becomes so important. So we do still need to ensure that we understand and evolve to that point where we can make it very clear what is the accountability we are asking for, so that it becomes easy for everyone to play their role effectively.
No, exactly. And I think we have many examples of what happens when the purpose and the values are not there. And locally, we have CLICO, we have Enron, we have AIG, you name it. When your focus is that you're exploiting the greater fool, you're not going to, and you're going to implode. I mean, there are examples, many examples all over. I want to give each of the panelists an opportunity to wrap it up, and then I will ask Professor Garratt to close. So let's start with Joanne, and we'll go to Wahid and Charlotte.
Thank you, Nigel. I've been here internalizing all the suggestions and particularly the content of Professor Garratt's speech, and also Charlotte talking about the work that she was doing with family-owned companies, and they've been successful without having to have a code. They, the right thing to do. That left me with the message that the right thing to do is the right thing to do, and
that's right.
Pardon?
That's right.
So the right thing to do. And it's also like performance management. You really don't need your supervisor to say to you, you haven't been performing well. You actually know that. But when you do have the performance management session, it kind of means that you both know that now, but you've always known it. So for me, in terms of looking to the future and building, and what Professor Garratt mentioned this morning, to me, very much ESG and moving the needle on that really needs to speak to the prominence we give to stakeholders. It doesn't mean that you're now going to be the multi-headed monster and you're trying to settle or weigh competing needs, because the context is always going to be the purpose of the organization and the principles and values and what's going to take the organization forward. I'd like to stop there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Wahid.
There's definitely, I think there is a disconnect between company maturity and corporate governance maturity. And I believe that once ESG comes in from the beginning, regardless of you're listed or non-listed, you know, if you're even a small pop and mom shop, if ESG comes into play and it has teeth and it's really measured and it's really part of the fabric of any organization, then I think that then we'll be heading on the right direction. But as the current state, the way it is right now, I don't think, you know, we're starting, but we need to move more quickly. Thank you.
So you think there is an element of a legislative element almost to getting ESG going?
I believe so. To a certain extent, you have to have it. I mean, that's unfortunately, that's
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Shala.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have to say I agree on that. I think I'm speaking later today about the Sustainable Development Goals and governance around that. And it's this mix between soft and hard law. So governance being soft, sort of people don't have to, they can get around it. Even the listed companies can try to get around it because it's a soft law. So I do agree that we need to consider to move the dial sufficiently and to change sufficiently what can remain soft law and what needs to be hard law to ensure that things change. And I think really we need to focus a little bit more on the basic values and purpose that I think starts with ourselves. It starts with us considering what is my personal values and purpose in life, and whatever business I operate with, how does that work well with my own values? If you're not even aware of your own values, it's kind of hard to start talking about business values. And I think COVID has showed us that we are all part of one. So back to the holistic picture, we are part of one cell. If you do something bad to other people or to the environment, to the planet, you do something bad to part of yourself. And I think that's really, really key to remember. But again, if you don't have your own basic values and purpose in place and look at things in that way as we are part of one, then I think it's going to be very hard to do the right changes. But if we can get more people to think in that way, then I think we will be able to move towards a different kind of governance that involves all of the different things that we need and should see and look at in all the businesses we run.
Thank you very much. Professor Garratt.
Well, first of all, thank you to all the panelists and to members of the audience, the participants. I found that very interesting. It's left me with 3 particular questions at the moment. I'm happy we have another day and a half to go to try and answer them. But one of the things it's made me think is I really must find a way with others to change ESG to EESG. So economic, environmental, social, plus governance, which begins to answer partly Kamla's question about the pyramid. So I must work on that. This whole notion of wealth, it wasn't the intention when we were putting this conference together to really be strong on wealth. But as I say, what's happening with Mike Benelli later today and then with Peter Aylwin, Peter is particularly interesting because he comes from the informal association of family businesses or family offices, sorry, not businesses, offices around the world, so massive investors. And if anybody can listen in to his session, I strongly recommend it because he's talking about the transfer of wealth across the generations, specifically, but not only, not exclusively, in family businesses. And the numbers he has to talk about are so large. I was literally knocked off my chair a few months ago when I was sitting with him in a rainstorm in Mayfair because we had to be outside because of COVID. But the numbers are just extraordinary. And although we're very depressed at the moment and we're sitting around, and many people are literally depressed after 9 months of lockdown. I think there's some very interesting possibilities opening up in this generational transfer of wealth, which most of us haven't really thought about at all. And I think it gives tremendous scope for developing EESG, and particularly some of the governmental aspects of that. But the last thing I'm thinking about from this discussion is, how do we better inform the public so they can ask critical questions of all of us, of directors, of legislators, of regulators, and of owners. And I will only be happy, and it may be well beyond my lifetime, but I will only be happy when the public are well informed in this area. Thanks.
Very critical. Thank you very much, Professor. Some very deep questions, some very deep issues. I see in the chat the whole question of what is right and determining what is right in whether the minority, how do you enforce minority rights and that kind of stuff. So I want to thank Professor Garratt, Charlotte, Wahid, and Joanne for a very stimulating start to the global conference. I think we have a lot to ponder upon, a lot to chew upon, and I look forward to the other sessions later today. Kamala, you want to close?
Thank you very much, Nigel. And I think this session really did live up to expectations. You know, I like the many things that it has opened up for us. Some of it very practical in the sense of what really are those next steps that we're going to capture as we review our code. So very much in line with what we need to do in the region. But I also like that we have ended where we start in terms of what are our roles and responsibilities to ensure that the general public also understands what governance is, and therefore will be able to have the conversation with us where we are both speaking the same language. That certainly is one of the roles that the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute recognizes that it needs to take up. You know, we need to ensure that there is sufficient advocacy, that all stakeholders are aware so that we all are able to help play our specific parts in this wonderful thing we call governance. So I want to thank everyone. It really has been tremendous.